Welcome to the Institute of All Intelligent Life. My name is Alan Kiesler, and we are continuing our class on extraterrestrial spirituality. So we have been discussing the Sumerian evidence, particularly texts from ancient Sumeria, dated thousands of years ago, and we are now coming to the person called Ziusudra in Sumerian texts. Utnapishtim. I keep making a mistake in the pronunciation of the different names, but Utnapishtim is one of the Babylonian names. Atrahasis is another name in the Mesopotamian texts, Akkadian texts. But what I want to do today is describe the story of this character, and you will see yourself the similarities with the story you may be familiar with of Noah. Because in the Sumerian story, and in the Babylonian story, and in many stories around the world, including from India, even China, even North America, South America, there is a record of a great flood, and the stories vary quite a bit. But the Sumerian and the Akkadian, the Mesopotamian texts, and the Hebrew Bible text, they're very similar. So we will just go over some of the major points of the Sumerian story and the differences between some of the stories and the similarities. So I won't go into the details about all the text sources. If you want to research that, you can just research Ziusudra on Wikipedia or other sources you can find information. There are quite a few texts that describe this story in the ancient clay tablets, going to even 2000 BC or so. That is the date of the tablets. The events in the tablets are debated. There's not agreement on that. But for me, the conclusion of Zachariah Sitchin makes the most sense. That is, he proposed that the ending of the last ice age coincided with the flood, the deluge. And the story I won't go into all the details of it, but you can read it in his book, The 12th Planet, where he gives all the details. There are many evidences that this time period fits very well. So, first of all, I will say a few things about the background, as we've discussed in the previous classes. In the Sumerian historical documents, mythology according to most Western scholars, but as we're taking them and as they themselves teach, they are actually historical events that they're describing. So according to the Sumerian texts, the king of the planet, Nibiru, was named or Anu, and he had two main sons, Enlil and Enki. So they had come to Earth, both Enlil and Enki, and I won't go into the details about the creation of humanity, as you can go back in the other classes to review that if you wish. But what happened eventually was that Enki became favorable to humanity because he was the genetic engineer, you might say, who was directly responsible for inserting some of his own DNA into an ovum of a primitive primate, an ape man, you might say, Homo erectus, and therefore they were sort of his own children, the human beings, the first Homo sapiens. So he was very favorable to them. Whereas Enlil, who was the superior son, because his mother was the main queen of King Anu, he was not so favorable to humanity. And as time passed, Enlil became disturbed. He was always worried about humanity multiplying too much and then getting more power, and then, although the Anunnaki, or the residents of Nibiru, had a far superior technology, still they were worried, or Enlil was worried, that humanity may become too numerous, and there were things about human beings that he didn't like. So eventually he came to the conclusion that humanity had progressed numerically too much, there were too many people, and especially it appears when some of the Anunnaki began mating with the human women. And it also happened the other way, that some of the Anunnaki women were mating with human men. And because of that, Enlil was extremely disturbed. This is just what he did not want to happen. He wanted to keep a clear distinction between the Anunnaki and humanity. So finally he got the other Anunnaki to agree. They decided to wipe out humanity. And without going into all the details of the Sumerian texts, there were many things that happened, not just the flood. There were famines, there were droughts, there were diseases, all which Enlil had either engineered or had spread or allowed to happen. And finally came the time when the Anunnaki knew that a great flood was going to happen. Evidently, this was a periodic thing, which happened at the end of ice ages. And the theory that some academic scholars have proposed, which Zacharias Sitchin accepts, which makes good sense to me, is that the Antarctic ice shelf, which builds up during the ice age, as the ice age comes to an end, when the ice age comes to an end, the two events are tied together. The Antarctic ice shelf slips off into the ocean, and we know that the Antarctic ice shelf averages a mile deep, 2, even 3 miles deep in some places. So it's a huge amount of ice, and if that whole shelf slips off, it creates a huge, huge tsunami. So evidently the Anunnaki were aware that this was going to be happening, because it happened periodically, and they were monitoring it. So the decision was made that humanity should be allowed to be destroyed totally at this time. And because Enlil had a favorable attitude, Enki had a favorable attitude towards humanity, specifically Enlil and the other Anunnaki insisted that he should make a vow, a very clear and firm promise, that he would not save humanity, because that was his tendency to do that. He had done it previously. So according to the Sumerian story again, all the evidence is not completely in the Sumerian texts, because some of them are partial and some of them are they're incomplete, or they're not available. The texts themselves may be broken, but supplemented by the Akkadian texts, the Babylonian texts, we can put together the story, because they're very, very similar, that when this was going to happen, then the Anunnaki left. They went into Earth orbit, you would say, and humanity was left on Earth to be destroyed totally by this flood. However, this is the interesting thing, Enki vowed that he would not tell any human beings, so he figured in a way to get around that by speaking to a wall, a reed wall, and one of his followers, that is Ziusudra, was behind the wall, the reed wall. And so Enki said he never told any human being, he was just telling the wall that the flood was coming and it would destroy all of humanity, and that it would be advisable to build a boat to save at least as many good people as he could, and some of the animals and other life on Earth, to preserve it through this time of great destruction. So Ziusudra understood that, and he did carry out that plan. He built a boat, which actually, it appears from the Sumerian texts, Babylonian texts, that it may have been a submarine, totally sealed, rather than what we think of as a boat with a windows on top. But in any case, the storm, according to the Sumerian texts and Babylonian texts, lasted for 7 days, and that it actually it even describes how the waves came and went and came and went. So it really sounds like a tsunami, because that's exactly what happens in a huge tsunami. That the water rises and then it subsides and rises, so waves come. So that's the way the Sumerian texts describe it. So after this period was over, it appears from these ancient texts that it may have been guided, that is, there may have been a plan already to take the boat to Armenia, to Mount Ararat, which is traditionally the mount that Noah landed on, according to at least the Christian tradition. So it was the highest mountain and was well known to the Sumerians because they used it as a marker in their space travel. So the boat landed then on Mount Ararat, and although the time period differs a little bit, but the basic story is practically the same in the Bible and in the Sumerian texts. That Ziusudra or Atrahasis or Utnapishtim or Noah, that person, when the ship had landed, and then he realized that the storm was receding, he did a sacrifice, and God or the gods were pleased, and everything was then resolved. Now, there were a couple of points that differ in the earlier versions and the biblical version. The main one is, of course, that the Sumerians are talking about, we may call them gods, but they were the Anunnaki, as the persons who were behind this, both behind allowing the flood or even causing the flood to happen, and then saving Ziusudra or Noah from the flood. In the Bible, it's a singular God, and in the older stories, it was the Anunnaki or the gods. And the biblical story does seem a little bit strange in the sense that God first decided to kill off all of humanity and then decided to save Noah and his family. So if we understand the Sumerian background, it makes better sense that it was Enlil who was wanting to destroy humanity, whereas Enki all along was trying to save humanity. So that's one point where the older versions seem to make more sense. And there were a couple of other things like that. But I want to read now. This is from the Ziusudra article in Wikipedia, just because some persons have suggested that Zachariah Sitchin's translations are not correct. So I won't deny that he could have made mistakes, and I'm sure he did. But basically, I think that he understood properly that these texts were not mythological, but they were historical. So, but I'm now quoting from the Wikipedia article on Ziusudra, Ziusudra. You can look it up if you want. And these are just some quotations about some of the similarities and slight differences between these stories. So there are 3 or 4 different non-biblical texts that talk about this, Mesopotamian texts. And I'm just going to read some of these quotes, which you can find for yourself on that Wikipedia article on Ziusudra. This first, Ziusudra is the name of one of the Sumerian texts, which says the storm had swept for 7 days and 7 nights. And the Akkadian or the Babylonian text, Etrahesis, also says, for 7 days and 7 nights came the storm. There's another text, a story about Gilgamesh, in which the flood story is also recounted. That also says 6 days and 7 nights the wind and storm. And the Genesis story, the Bible story, says the rain fell upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Now, we know that the number 40 is a very important number in the biblical context, especially when we talk about time, 40 days. So it seems to me to make sense that the number 7 could have been increased in the biblical story to 40, simply because all these older texts agree on 7 days and 7 nights, and if we think about a tsunami and a big storm continuing, the tsunami would recede, the waters created by a monstrous tsunami would recede within a week. So I think that that's one way to explain the difference between those stories. Another one is Ziusudra made an opening in the large boat. That's from the text called Ziusudra, the Sumerian text. So that may indicate that the boat actually was like a submarine. It didn't have a window. But the other Mesopotamian texts talk about a window, opening a window. And in the biblical version also, Noah opened the window of the ark. Then there's the story in all the accounts that then a sacrifice was offered. Gilgamesh says, and he offered a sacrifice. Atrahasis, he offered a sacrifice. Genesis says he offered burnt offerings on the altar. And then finally there's, quotes, the gods smelled the savor, the sweet smell of the sacrifice. That's Atrahasis, the Gilgamesh epic. These are the Mesopotamian ones. We don't have the original. These are the later ones, but we don't have the original story in Ziusudra because that section is missing in the Sumerian texts. But in these other Babylonian texts, it has this same statement. The Gilgamesh epic has the gods smelled the sweet savor. And the Genesis story says, and the Lord smelled the sweet savor. So it's the very same, but there's a difference. The gods, that is the Anunnaki, are the plural, and they are the ones to whom the sacrifice was offered, and they are the ones who smelled the sweet savor of the sacrifice. And in the biblical version, the Lord. There's only one God mentioned. So this, there are a lot of details that I'm not going to go into now, which can be studied if you want to in, again, Zachariah Sitchin's book is the best source to find all of these in one place, and his arguments showing how the ancient stories make sense. They make better sense, and we can understand how the biblical story was derived from that. Of course, somebody may want to say that the Bible was revealed totally by God. Every single word is direct from the divinity. So it's not acceptable to those people to say that the biblical text was based on earlier texts or derived from them. But if we will accept the possibility, or we could say that maybe God wanted to use those stories because they were familiar. People were familiar with those stories. So maybe God wanted to use those stories to make a point. The point is, and of course the main point in the biblical account, which differs from the accounts of the earlier texts, was that there's only one God. So the Bible talks about one God, even though the Mesopotamian earlier texts talk about a plural of gods, or a plural of, not really gods, because we don't use the word God to describe them now. A G with a small G God maybe, but I would call them extraterrestrials, the Anunnaki, who had great technological powers, great technological weapons, technological instruments, something like cell phones, something like computers, and weapons like laser weapons and nuclear weapons. So they were very, very powerful, and so they were worshipped like gods by the human beings. But the Bible wants to make the point that there's only one God. But since these stories were well known at that time, 2000 BC, 1500 BC, 1000 BC, that is, during the time of Abraham, these stories were well known. During the time of Moses, these stories were well known in Egypt as well as in Babylonia, and of course in Palestine also, all throughout the Western Asia and North Africa, Northeastern Africa, these stories were well known. So I would explain this by saying, if you want to take that position, that this is from God, that God used those stories and told them in a slightly different way in order to make the point that there really is only one God. All right, that was just a slight side point, but the main point I'm making is we need to understand that these stories were pre-existing. These stories are in much more detail than the biblical account, and they explain many things, not only the Noah story, the story of Genesis, the story of the creation of humanity, is in much more detail and makes very good sense with our knowledge today about genetic engineering. So this is the main point I'm making here, that if we read these ancient Sumerian texts, the ancient Mesopotamian texts, we not only understand their concepts, their extraterrestrial spirituality, because these were extraterrestrials that were giving this information to us, the Anunnaki from the planet Nibiru. Of course, it's their version. I want to say that I don't accept all these Sumerian texts as 100% accurate. They are their version. They're their timeline, you might say. They're the version of history that they wanted to create for their own glorification. We're the creators of humanity. There could have been many other explanations which may have been present at that time that they were wanting to defeat, or whatever the story is. They did write a lot of these things down in 4,000 years ago even, which we now have the documents, we have the texts. So this was before Moses, before Abraham. So we need to look at this reasonably, rationally, and understand that these explanations are something that may be beneficial to us, to understand our own spirituality and religion better from a broader perspective. And of course that's the main reason why I'm teaching this course, really, is because we can gain more information from other sources. We should not limit ourselves to only the sources that we've been familiar with for hundreds and thousands of years. But if we are able to get other information from extraterrestrial sources or from archaeological sources, as we're more dealing with now, then we should be open to that. That information may be helpful to us to understand the whole situation. And of course we are going to talk more in the near future about other extraterrestrial sources. All right. So I think we can go to questions and comments now, because I see there are a lot of them. Let's just see, I'm going to see any particular questions or comments about this. I'm not going to answer other questions that are coming up again and again, like where are you? I'm going to look for other comments that may be more applicable to this course. Okay, Kashif Kamran has said, MashaAllah, looking graceful. May Allah give more hidayat to you and all. Yes. This is exactly, as I said the first day, this is what I'm looking for, more guidance from God. I believe that there is a God and that God does give guidance to humanity. So that's what I'm looking for. And I do believe that God can give us guidance through extraterrestrial sources also. That's my firm belief, my own experience, and that's why I'm teaching this course. Okay, Shakil Sibtain says, I read a few days ago that the Russian president is going to reveal some hidden truth about ETs, that is extraterrestrials. Last year you said Donald Trump promised to say something about ETs, but he is not doing anything towards it. I don't remember saying that Donald Trump had promised to say something about ETs, but Hillary Clinton had definitely said that she was going to reveal more information about ETs. If Donald Trump said that, I'm not saying he didn't, I don't remember having said that he said that, but he is obviously not able to do the things that he said he was going to do. In other words, he had many things he wanted to do, he said he would do, he promised he would do, and now he's not doing them. Either because he never intended to do them, he was just lying in order to get votes, or as I believe, there were some of those things he really did want to do, and he was not able to do them because he was threatened that if he did do them, he and his family would be harmed. So many people have wanted to, even presidents of the United States like Jimmy Carter also promised that he would reveal the information about ETs when he became president. And when he became president, he called the CIA director, who was George Bush. The senior George Bush was the director of CIA then, before he became president. And he directly refused the president, I'm not going to give you that information. It's on a need-to-know basis. You don't need to know that. So a lot of times the presidents can't do what they want to do. All right, let's see. उर्दू में बात करो, इंग्लिश समझ नहीं आती. I'm sorry, but this class is in English. मैं ये क्लास अंग्रेज़ी में ले रहा हूँ और ये अंग्रेज़ी होगा. आप उर्दू सुनना चाहते हैं, आपको कोई दूसरा बाद में मेरा चैट सुनना होगा. माफ़ करें. Imran Javed, God saves humanity and loves mercy and goodness, however. God dislikes bad deeds and association of partners with God. This is definitely the message, not only of the Bible and of other sacred texts, but is also really basically the message in the Mesopotamian texts. Although it doesn't talk about the singular God, it does talk about Enki as being the person who was saving humanity in these stories, both in the story of the flood, and there are also other stories when there was a great famine, which Enlil and other of the Anunnaki, when they were wanting to destroy humanity, pestilences, diseases, but Enki was always trying to save humanity. So that story is there, long before the Bible was written even, and before the time of Moses. So but the message is certainly that God saves humanity and loves mercy and goodness. That's the biblical message. And even in the Mesopotamian texts, that sort of message is given, at least regarding Enki, who was not God, but he was worshipped as a god by many of the people in the West Asia, the Middle East, the Babylonian region. And certainly God dislikes bad deeds and association of partners with God. Okay, this is a very important topic, and I'm very, very interested in exploring how the what should we say, the multiple gods of the Mesopotamian period, the Sumerian and the Babylonian period, how that relates to the later monotheistic idea of the Bible and the Quran, and how do those two relate, not from the perspective of the later texts, but from a, what's the right word to use? Scientific, you might say. I'm trying to resolve, if you read my website, allintelligentlife.com, I've explained there that my real purpose in this whole Institute of All Intelligent Life is to resolve the differences between different groups of humanity, different religions, because there are differences and contradictions, and each one says my religion is right and the others are all wrong. So instead of accepting that, I have decided that I will try to resolve the differences between the different religions by comparing them with each other very carefully and by comparing them with a scientific perspective and knowledge, and with extraterrestrial information. So in this case, some people may not like what I'm doing, but this is really what I'm doing. I'm trying to understand better. I'm trying to get guidance from God better by comparing all these sources. Because I find that the present approach, where each religion claims that it is right and it is best, and it disregards the other sources, it's better to be open to all of them and study all of them, accepting that there are other sources of information just than the ones that we traditionally have accepted. Okay. All right, I think that's enough now. This is a very, very difficult topic, no doubt. I myself have struggled with it for many, many years. How to resolve the differences between different sources of knowledge, whether they're different religions, whether it's science and religion, whether it's extraterrestrial sources and terrestrial sources. But I hope that you are getting some insights from this, maybe surprising or even shocking or very, very unpleasant to hear these things, but these are the facts, that these ancient texts tell these stories which are so similar to the stories in the Bible and the Quran, that they're obviously related. And if we compare them, we may gain some insights. So that is my prayer, that is my effort, and I hope all of you will not be too upset with me, but will try to open your minds and open your hearts to this approach. And I will just conclude by saying, when the Europeans came to Africa and Asia and the Americas, they brought a lot of information. The people that were open to accepting that information often benefited. For example, the technology that they had. The Europeans were able to conquer most of the world because they had superior technology in terms of weapons, guns, cannons, and those people who were able to adopt those things and adapt themselves to that new information, they benefited from it. So what I'm suggesting now is that extraterrestrials are coming to our planet. They have a lot of technological information and knowledge that we haven't had commonly. We're getting it very quickly in the 20th century. Everything from electricity, even, we didn't have much more than 100, 150, 200 years ago, certainly we didn't have. Now it's become common every day. Computers, lasers, a lot of this technology is something that actually has come from extraterrestrials. We've adopted it without knowing the source. But if we accept this possibility, then I think we're going to be able to progress, and we'll be able to face this challenge of becoming a part of the galactic family of, we say the family of nations, now we're saying the family of planets, and the family of star systems, and even the family of galaxies, because there are people from other galaxies even who have visited our planet. So I'm trying. I'm struggling, frankly. I'm telling you, I've been struggling for many years with all of this, but it's something that I'm now sharing with you. All right, thank you all very much, and I look forward to seeing you at the next class, Monday evening, 7 p.m. California time, Tuesday morning, 7 a.m. Pakistan time. Thanks very much.